Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show. Join me on the phones right now. A guy who's been crisscrossing the country, chasing after political candidates who want to be in the White House. It's Patrick Svitek with the Texas Tribune. Patrick, good morning. How are you today?
Morning, Chad. I'm doing well.
Thanks for joining us. So you've been crisscrossing the country, following some of the different presidential candidates. In particular, I guess the last 2 weeks you've been following, or is it last week? I guess, 1 week. Beto O'Rourke. It seems like it's been 2 weeks. Beto O'Rourke, he announced that, of course, he's running for president, had the $6.1 million fundraising haul within the first 24 hours. And you were following his campaign through some of these early states. What did you take away from the O'Rourke early first week presidential campaign?
Yeah, I mean, he is getting very strong crowds and very strong receptions, and I think a lot of it, is due to the buildup and the hype that was surrounding his decision. You have to remember that in places like Iowa and New Hampshire, he did not visit them in the lead-up to this decision like so many prospective potential candidates do, and so for many audiences in these early voting states, this is literally the first time they're seeing him in person. They didn't have an opportunity to see him in the lead-up to this decision, so I think that has created a lot of enthusiasm, and there's been a lot of, I think, pent-up demand on the ground in these states to finally see him there. At the same time, he is adjusting to the heightened scrutiny that comes with a presidential campaign. He did not face this level of scrutiny in the Senate race last year. The media coverage was different, but also the issue set was different. There's different issues and litmus tests that you're going to face in a national Democratic primary in this day and age, and you're going to face in a statewide general election in a red state. And so he's navigating a lot of these different issues and new sources of scrutiny, in some cases being very honest about changes in positions or things that he regrets that he said or did in the past. Some of these things are political, some of them are personal, but he's really, it seems like he's really almost trying to kind of figure it out as he goes. And I don't say that necessarily negatively, but he really seems to be kind of, barreling through kind of a learning curve as a presidential candidate. And as you pointed out, the backdrop of this has been a hectic campaign schedule, not just visiting the traditional early voting states like Iowa and New Hampshire, but visiting a number of Midwestern states in between places that candidates don't typically go this early in the process. So it's been, quite a chaotic start to the campaign in that regard.
How does that compare? Because I know you've also followed Julian Castro's campaign as he's gone around and running for office, and people tend to forget that he's another Texan running for president. How do those two campaigns compare as far as message and maybe even preparedness? Because it seems like Castro, even though he's not getting the headlines, it seems like he's got his stuff a little bit more together. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I think that it's fair to say that Castro is running a more formal, organized, professionalized campaign. O'Rourke has never run campaigns that are particularly, I would say, overly professionalized, as we discussed before. He's sworn off kind of consultants who shape the message, and he's sworn off pollsters. And so I think part of that is just in his nature as a politician. Also, Castro had basically 2 years to prepare for his presidential campaign. He left President Obama's cabinet at the end of Obama's term in January 2017, and he had no day job and was able to travel to all these early voting states and lay the groundwork for his campaign. Now, it's not taking off the way that O'Rourke's campaign appears to be taking off, but there's no doubt that he's had more time to prepare and is running what I would consider a more formal and in some ways more conventional campaign than O'Rourke is.
How would you compare the crowds? When you had O'Rourke running in Texas, obviously, as we got closer and closer to the end of the election, and even during the middle of the election, he had huge crowds. Anywhere he went, here in Lubbock, Texas, he would have a big crowd. You go down to Houston, he would have a big crowd. How does that compare to some of these other states where he's maybe not as widely known?
Yeah, O'Rourke's crowds have been very strong in Iowa and in New Hampshire. Those are the two states where I've traveled with him in person and then watched and followed his events in the states in between. But he's been getting huge crowds overflow audiences that he has to address, and people seem, as I pointed out earlier, very enthusiastic to finally see him in person after hearing so much hype in the media and build up over the past several months after his closer than expected loss to Ted Cruz. By contrast, Castro's crowds are much more modest, and I think you would expect based on the polling and just the kind of what you're hearing anecdotally. I saw Castro in Iowa a couple weeks ago, and he held a town hall in Des Moines that I think maybe there was 80 or 90 people at, which is probably his the biggest city in Iowa, and that was probably his best attended event of the trip. Healthy sized crowd, but people weren't leaping over furniture to get a picture with him afterward, as they are at so many of these work events. I mean, clearly, and I think this is just well established at this point that Castro's star power has just right now cannot come close to the star power that O'Rourke has cultivated.
So some of the stories that we see, at least from the national media, is that when O'Rourke is making these stump speeches and he's stopping in some of these cities, that he's had to go back and bring up controversies from the past. I don't know if he's addressed the DWI thing or not, but he had to address, I guess, a joke that was kind of a self-deprecating joke, and people took it out of context, or they got offended by it for some reason, about his wife. There's a lot of things he's had to explain. How does that come across when he's at an event? And do you actually have people asking him pointed questions about policy? Because we see some of that making national headlines, that people in the audience are like demanding policy.
Right, yeah, I'll take that in two parts. On the specific joke that you mentioned, that was a great example of something that he said or did in the Senate race that never drew any scrutiny, quite frankly. But now that he's in the national Democratic primary, in a primary field that is very focused on issues of race and gender and diversity, him joking about his wife, bearing most of the burden of raising their kids, is no longer something that escapes notice.
To me, it's like the guy was kind of complimenting his wife, but okay, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, back in Texas, that no one really batted the last that line. But in this, very kind of woke environment, it's certainly something that drew attention within a matter of just like 2 or 3 days in the campaign trail. So that was a great example of the kind of heightened scrutiny, a new level of scrutiny that he has. People on policy, I wouldn't say there's an overwhelming demand for him to be more detailed, but he is running into questioners at some of these events who are asking him to be more specific. Now, some of these questioners do appear to be aligned with other candidates, like Bernie Sanders, for example, who has some pretty kind of bright line positions on the issues. But he's getting those questions, and over the course of the week, I have seen him evolve a little bit and offer a little more clarity on issues as he's been pressed on them. For example, on health care, he's increasingly spoken favorably of a specific piece of legislation called Medicare for America, which is different than Medicare for all. There's a whole bunch of other questions that come with that, but nonetheless, to get to your point, he has kind of over the course of this week, I have witnessed him get a little more detailed and talk a little more about specific plans and specific policies. I think he still has a long way to go, but he seems definitely aware of that knock and seems to be adjusting accordingly.
Well, we're visiting with Patrick Svitek of the Texas Tribune. Patrick, when you look at the Beto O'Rourke who's running for president right now and compare some of the things that he is saying now and some of the policies that he's talking about now, when you compare that to the Texas Senate campaign and some of the things that he would say then, is there a difference in those two Betos? Is there a shift in direction from Beto O'Rourke, or is this the same guy?
I think he has, if you look at, the remarks that he gives at the top of his events where he just kind of talks off the top of his head, I think he's generally remained true to the same themes and issues that he highlighted in his Senate campaign. There are some issues I think he may be playing up a little more now that he's a national Democratic candidate. Climate change is one of them, but I think that also coincides with a increasing focus on that issue within the Democratic primary, with things like the Green New Deal coming to prominence. That obviously wasn't around during the Senate race. Yeah. But I think generally speaking, he rhetorically is still the same candidate and still talking about the same aspirations and goals and issues.
Yeah. All right. Well, obviously he's running for president. He's raising a lot of money, and I think next weekend? That's when he officially kicks off things in El Paso and takes a little tour of the major Texas cities. Yeah,
next Saturday, March 30th, I believe. He'll hold a morning rally in El Paso to kind of formally kick off his campaign. If you didn't already think he was running for president, and then he's going to head later in the day to Houston and Austin to hold similar kind of launch rallies in those cities.
Yeah. All right, Patrick. Tell folks what you're working on and what people can find at Texas Tribune.
Yeah, well, we're obviously covering both the presidential campaigns that are working Julian Castro and chronicling the Texas legislative session. You can find it all at texastribune.org.
All right. As always, Patrick, we appreciate your time, and at least you get a little bit of time away from the campaign trail today. You can relax.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Have a good one. Chad Hasty Show, KFYO.